You're listening to Served Up, a podcast that features inspiring beverage professionals and topic experts that share their passions through meaningful conversations. I'm your host, Bridget Albert, also known as the Market Fresh Mixologist, an industry mentor with decades of experience. Grab a cocktail and sit back. Let's learn how we can make a positive impact in our industry. Hey y'all, it's Bridget here. I'm thrilled to introduce an engaging conversation with Chris Cardone, the principal owner of Continuous Beverage Solutions, a change maker in the hospitality industry. Chris brings a wealth of knowledge as a hospitality consultant and mixologist, shaping beverage programs that elevate experiences and drive success. In this interview, he shares insights into his journey, the trends in the industry, and how his innovative approach is transforming the way we think about drinks and service. So sit back, relax, grab yourself your favorite cocktail, and enjoy the show. Chris, welcome to Served Up. I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself? So Let's go deep. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And when did you become curious about beverage as an industry and as a potential career?
When you asked me to go deep, I thought you were going to ask me my sign. I grew up on Long Island, but don't tell anybody because it'll totally ruin my rep. Okay. I have actually been born and raised on Long Island and still to this day live on Long Island, which is kind of where I sleep more than anything else, I would say. I do the majority of my work in New York City. I became interested in beverage when I was 20. I was going to college in Pennsylvania at a school called Bloomsburg University, and I was studying to be a marketing and advertising and PR rep. I was studying for finals before I went home for my summer of between my junior and my senior year. And I was a little burnt out. And I said, I'm going to go to the video store. And I know I just became a grandfather just now when I said the video store, because probably half the listeners are like, what's a video store? I went down the street and was looking around at what movie to rent so I could have a little downtime before continuing to study. And I saw a movie that I had never seen before called Cocktail. And I thought it sounded good. I was always a Tom Cruise fan growing up as an 80s kid. Top Gun was always a big one for me. And so I said, all right, let me see this cocktail movie. And I remember vividly watching it and thinking to myself, I want to be these guys. This is awesome. And I legitimately finished finals, went home and looked up the closest bartending school to my house, signed up that Monday and started bartending the following Monday.
Wow, that's incredible. It really is. And so you just jumped right behind the bar. And what was going through your head? Because usually our first bartending gig is nothing like Cocktails and Dreams.
It's funny because it wasn't, but at the same time, it sort of was in that the bar, it's kind of a funny story. So I graduated from bartending school and you can't see, but I'm using the little quotation marks of graduated because it's kind of silly, right? But I finished up and we had the bartending school I went to had a little sort of, we'll call it a tradition that after you graduated, they took the class out to a bar across the street for your first sort of like after graduation cocktail and that kind of thing. And so I went across the street and the bartender working at the bar, which no joke was called the Roadhouse. And just like the movie, it was the Roadhouse. It was a dive bar where fights took place every night. It kind of was like what you'd expect something out of a Jim Morrison movie where it was very grungy / like just rough and tough. And everyone was kind of grizzled. There was a lot of construction workers, a lot of people drinking heavy. And there was the jukebox with the Doors and Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles and all that kind of stuff on there. It was a very cool environment to have your first job at. So anyway, I walked up to the bar and lo and behold, a friend of mine from high school was tending bar that afternoon on that Friday. And I told her, I said, yeah, I just graduated the bartending school. And she said, we're looking for a bartender on a Monday night. And the owner's down at the end of the bar. If you want me to introduce him to you, I'm happy to. And I said, yeah, sure. I'd love to. And I went over. The guy's name was Mike. He was a character and a half. And I introduced myself and he said, yeah, if you want Mondays, yeah, sure, you can have them. As sort of as though like, why would you want to do Mondays at this place? And I was like, of course, I'll take it. I'll do it. And it was to this day, I'm about to hit 25 years of tending bar. It was to this day the most fun job I've ever had. And it wasn't because it was my first one. It was because it was just no holds barred. It was, you could do anything you wanted there. It was incredible. It was not the best paying job I've ever had. It was certainly not cocktails or anything like that. And I did do a little flair behind the bar because at the time, flair bartending was more of a thing than cocktails were. But it was just wild. I mean, there was one night where we had a water balloon fight in the bar.
That's wonderful. I mean, some of my best memories as well, was early on in my bartending career at a nightclub and literally just standing on the bar and spraying everybody with Bud Light. It was not Coyote Ugly either, or, any of the crazy bars like we see today. And I definitely didn't learn like flair, like at a TGI Fridays or anything cool. But can we talk about flair bartending? Because I think for a lot of our listeners may not be hip to that term. And I think we should create shirts that like, let's make flair bartending great again, because it was such a fun era and is so much fun and so entertaining and has a purpose at the bar. So can you talk to that?
Absolutely. I am all on board of making anything that doesn't have the words great again on it. So let's come up with a better name. And then I'm all in on that one. Okay. So flair bartending was all the rage in the 90s and early 2000s. This was pre-cocktail. Cocktails didn't exist at that time. A cocktail at that time was, I guess you could call it a vodka martini was a cocktail, and there was sex on the beach, and there was, the drinks were just awful back then, but they were sugary, off-balanced, terrible things, but bars were a lot more fun back then because it was more about entertaining. It was more about sort of being a showman. And so the technical term, if you want to get into it, flair bartending is just simply manipulating your tools and creating a little bit more pizzazz, I guess, behind a bar in some way. But when I got into bartending, again, the movie Cocktail was sort of my inspiration. Coyote Ugly literally was in the theaters when I started bartending. And I had an instructor at the school who was competing in a bartending competition about, I think it was like a month or two after I had finished, called Quest for the Best. And it was in Florida at City Walk in Orlando. And he was, I'm trying to think, he was going into, I want to say it was the intermediate division. Back then there was like the pro, the intermediate, and the amateur division. And he was going into the intermediate division. So he knew how to do it pretty well. And he showed me some stuff. And then we had a bartending competition for flair bartending in August, right before I went back to college for my senior year. And it was so much fun. It was like, again, it was so basic, but at the same time, everyone's throwing around tins and bottles and making drinks with a lot of fun. And there was lots of things falling on the ground and breaking. And it was just, again, it was just the time. It was more about, it was a lot less professional, but it was certainly a lot of fun. And it got into my blood. And then when I went to my senior year of college, I graduated and I came back and I had all intentions of continuing with my degree. So I got a job doing public relations at a firm in Long Island, and I would work there Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And then Friday and Saturday nights, I would go bartend at a bar called The Library. And it's so funny because it's about to hit 25 years, and yet I feel like I remember it like it was yesterday. But I would go to work, and the big story when I first got out of college was that Mariah Carey was performing at one of the malls, and I was given that story to write. And so it was just write it, bring it to my boss, slash through with a red pen, rewrite, go back to my desk, write it again, go back to the desk with my boss, slash it through it, rewrite. And it's just over and over and over again. And I felt like I was not getting anywhere with it. And then I would go to work at the bar, and it was like I was live. It was a completely different feeling. And I think I made it maybe 3 months. And I was like, the writing was on the wall for me very quickly. And so I remember telling my parents, I said, yeah, I'm gonna quit this job. This isn't what I want to do. I'm gonna figure it out, but this is not what I was gonna do. And I could see it in their eyes and their reactions like, oh, that's great. You're gonna bartend. Good, awesome, fantastic. And I would go to work, and like I said, I just felt alive. But it was, as I said, it was just a very different time. Cocktails had not really happened yet.
Yeah, well, let's talk about when you started really honing your craft, right? And it really brought you to one of the most, if not like the most prestigious bartending competition that still exists today, which is the Diageo World Class Bartending. So take us through that experience for you.
So it's interesting because I'm going to probably say something that maybe a lot of people wouldn't agree with. And that's sometimes okay, because I think when you say things that people don't always agree with, at least gets conversations going and gets different thoughts happening. So I would argue that I started honing my craft when I started bartending at the Roadhouse. And the reason I say that was that back then, cocktails, like I said, were not a thing, but you had to learn how to make people like you because of the way you spoke to them, treated them, looked them in the eye, and paid attention to them. Because this bar was full of construction workers and electricians, and these were not the guys who would come into my bar and think, oh, great, there's some 20-year-old dude bartending. I'm so happy to see him. That was not the crowd. The crowd back then, and again, I know 2025 is a different world than 2000 was, but the crowd back then wanted a really pretty girl behind the bar. They had no interest in working with a 20-year-old bartender. So I had to learn how to make them like me and not go, oh, God, this guy. And that was not easy. And that was back when you had to empty ashtrays, when you had to be attentive for an empty beer sitting in your rail that meant I want another beer now. And you had to learn how to pivot from conversation to conversation and be able to, and what I would argue, be able to bartend, which is not the same as making cocktails. That's a form of bartending, and that's certainly an aspect of the skill, but that is not bartending. Bartending is tending the bar, which in my opinion is every single aspect from inside the glass to outside the glass in hospitality in every aspect. So I would say I would argue that I started at that point. Then flair was the next part of my craft, learning how to manipulate my tools in a really fancy way. And it was funny because I'm going to take a quick tangent here. I had a very cool lunch with Gary Regan before he passed away, and we were talking about flair. And Gary never did any flair or anything like that, but he said, he would argue that simply the way you stir a cocktail or the way you shake a cocktail is flair bartending if you're doing it in a way that doesn't look like everyone else. And it felt like a light bulb went off in my head because at the time that we were having that discussion, I had not competed in world class yet, but I'd competed in flair bartending competitions at that point for probably 6-7 years. And I was at that point a judge. But I said to him, I said, you're 100% right in that it doesn't have to be a 4-bottle juggle to be flair bartending. It's just doing it where people sitting at your bar go, whoa, this person, guy or girl, really knows how to bartend. They can feel it just by the way you're holding things, the way you're moving. I would argue if you go to London and you go to certain bars and they pour those really, really, really long high martinis, that's flair bartending. I would argue that stirring 4 cocktails at the same time is flair bartending. I would argue that the way you snap your pour at the end of a strained cocktail is flair bartending. So I was learning that aspect of it. And then when I got to world class, well, I guess I should back that up. And then in 2007, I was at a bartending competition called the Big Apple Showdown, which was at the Jacob Javits Center in New York. And I was one of the organizers. And one of the other judges, a guy named Mike McLean, who at the time worked for the company called Flairco, which made the Flair bottle, they said they were going to go out to a bar afterwards. We always, went out. It was kind of a family thing. We wanted to catch up and talk about our lives and things. And he said, I'm going to this bar. You want to come with us? It's called Milk and Honey. And I had never heard of it. And I was like, yeah, sure. I'd love to go. And again, so vivid. I can describe it in perfect detail. We get up to the door. There's no sign. And I'm looking at him. And Milk and Honey was not in the best area back in the day. So I remember walking up to the door being like, I don't feel like we're safe right now out here. And they open the door, they ask for our name. We go through, it's a black curtain. You can't see anything ahead of you. We go through, and all of a sudden we're transported into this 1920s feeling bar where everything's brick wall and it's candlelit and jazz is on. And I remember thinking to myself, what the hell is this? It was so different than anything I had ever experienced before. And the guy at the bar is, shaking, and it's really loud. The shake, not the bar. The shake was really loud, which I had never heard before because we were all using crap ice at that point. And I sit down at the bar. There's no menu. And he introduces us and says, welcome to Milk and Honey. Let's talk. What do you like to drink? And he makes us these custom cocktails based on what we like and what we're in the mood for, and introduces himself. And his name is Sasha, and pretty nice guy, right? I did not know the presence I was in the company of at that point. Now, obviously, I certainly know who he was, but I was blown away. And I remember thinking, holy shit, like this is the future. This is going to change the game. And it did. And I didn't know at the time that Dale DeGroff and Julie Reiner and Audrey Saunders were sort of doing their own things. I had never been to Bemelman's or anything like that. But it didn't take me very long to learn what the Flatiron Lounge was, the Pegu Club, who Dale DeGroff was. It was quick. And then I remember going and buying Gary's book and Dale's book and just immersing myself in the cocktail world. So by the time World Class came around, the writing was on the wall. Flair was on the way out. Cocktails were on the way in. And so my entire career was now surrounding with cocktail knowledge. And I was in New York, so it was a bit of a spoils of riches back then because you had so much education at the time where Pernod was getting into it and Bar Smarts existed. And it was just, you were just the USBGNY, you were getting pounded with possibilities for education and brand knowledge and cocktail knowledge and people speaking. It was an incredible time. There was so much energy going on at the time. And so when I first sent in my submission for 2013 for World Class, I didn't get through. My drink was horrific looking back at it. But the next year I finally got through. And the reason I kind of went into that tangent of all of the honing of the craft was that in 14, when I got through, I didn't understand what I was getting myself into, really. I knew it was a big bartending competition, but I didn't really understand. So I walk into Boston and the room is filled with, I'm talking talent. I remember thinking to myself, whoa, I do not belong in this room right now. I am way in over my head. And so when I had that reaction, looking around who else was in the room, the other 14 people were heavy hitters from Boston and Philly and DC and New York. And I felt so over my head. I said, all right, I'm just going to go and have some fun. And that's it. And I was just playing with house money. I didn't really have anything prepped. I didn't really have any stories or speeches or anything. And I got through. And I remember thinking to myself, there should probably be a recount. I probably was not supposed to get through. And then when I got to the finals, I had that same exact feeling. I'm looking at Charles Joly across the table from me and Julio Cabrera and Steve Schneider and Tyson Bueller. And I mean, I can pretty much name all 14 of the finalists because they were all, again, they've gone on to do incredible things across the board. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't belong here either. So I'm just going to go have some fun with it and just enjoy this experience. And I ended up taking fourth. And I remember going in the elevator with Sean Kenyon and Jim Meehan afterwards. And the two of them, Sean Kenyon at the time was working with Liquid Pro to do the production aspect of it. And then Jim Meehan was one of the judges. We were in the elevator and they were saying, you were our favorite bartender of the whole thing because you were the only one who was just bartending. You were just having fun. Everyone else was stressed and had pressure and was serious. And you were just laughing and being stupid and silly and having fun and making drinks. And that was a big moment for me to realize that you don't have to fit a mold at that competition. You can be yourself. And that's what then 3 years later, I think got me across the board to win.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, I guess, it's just very interesting. You said, it's like bartending is one thing and honing your craft early on, which I agree with 110%. When you said that you had to clean ashtrays, I started in the beverage industry 30 years ago, and that I had to clean ashtrays as well at the bar. And I was actually a cigarette girl for a while. Okay. But I remember the saying, and maybe this belongs on a t-shirt, was one butt, two butt, three butts, your butt. Talking about the cigarette. That was like what we were, you'd get in trouble. You get it written up if there were three butts in that cigarette tray. But it's so interesting to me that not only did you hold dear the term hospitality, but you also recognized, right, when you walked into Milk and Honey and like, okay, this is something new. This is something different. This is something I want to be part of. And it really was such a special time. I do feel today that bartenders are a bit spoiled, for sure. We didn't have, and I'm going to sound like, get off my lawn, but, we didn't have like the Google or YouTube where you could learn like so many things. You really had to go out and hit the pavement like you did. And you boldly put yourself into a position to be judged at a world-renowned cocktail competition, which takes a lot of oomph. And I'm so glad that you went in with the thinking that, I'm going to have fun with this. Because I think that's something that we forget sometimes in hospitality, and how fun and caring about our customer really does weigh more than what's in the cocktail itself. Because I think
100%.
You can teach anybody to make a cocktail, but you can't teach anybody to be kind. Right.
That's right.
That's something that you're just it's just already in you. So I think your story is not only endearing, but it's an important story because it shows like you can start here and wind up there if you care about the industry.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what you do today?
Well, what I was going to say is that it's what you were saying resonated because I think that the opportunity to learn nowadays is so much more broad than it used to be. What you said about, you can go on the internet. And I think it's an awesome opportunity that you can now go on YouTube and Instagram and all of these other avenues, TikTok, right? You can learn how to make a cocktail, how to make a syrup, how to make a tincture, how to make a foam and air. I mean, on and on and on. And it's really funny because I'm pitching a concept that I'm hoping to get picked up in an educational aspect that is called skyscrapers built on Jell-O. And the reason that I'm pitching that is that something I'm seeing is that with all of the advanced techniques like carbonation and clarification and all of these things that we're seeing that are becoming so immensely popular in the industry, people are forgetting that the foundation is still the key. You can build 100-story building, but if it's on a foundation of Jell-O, it's going to collapse. And so I really like a quote where a few years ago, there was, if we're in the golden age of cocktails, then why do they all suck? And I really liked that quote because I find that when I go out and I try cocktails, the majority of them, not all of them by any means, but the majority of them are off balance. And not terribly, but they're off balance in some way. They're either too hot, they're either too sweet, too sour, too bitter, muddy, and there's just no discernible flavor. There's lots of work that needs to be done. And I think a lot of that comes from the foundation of things. So when I judge world class, they usually, not so much in the national finals, but in the regionals and especially on the internet level at the beginning, they are usually in some way off balance. But the thing that I find interesting the majority of the time is that the majority of cocktails, when I try to find a classic root, it's missing. There is none. And I try and I'm looking at the cocktail and I'm like, where is this coming from? And I'll be like, it's like half old fashioned, half Manhattan, half Ramos. And I'm like, well, how is this? Where did you get this classic from? So one of the more common questions I ask when we get to a regional level and I'm in front of the competitors is, what classic does this have root in? And a lot of them look at me and you can see it in their eyes. And then they come up with some form of quick answer that they're like, oh, but I catch them off guard because I think a lot of new bartenders don't understand that you have to have some sort of classic. And that can go in probably any industry you could think of. And it's funny because with your guitars and your back behind you, I think about the music industry because I grew up, I was born in the 80s, but I grew up in the 90s. And so my whole entire life was based around grunge music. And everything, I have a lot of musical, we'll say, influence in my life in different aspects. But you think about music and there's no new music that comes out. It's all from some other past history that has been reformulated in some way. And so grunge was a form of punk. And you can go back and back and back with this, no matter what. And so cocktails are no different than music or fashion or anything else, that there has to be some that you start from and then you work your way and change it up. And you can make that cocktail into a 2025 new age classic, but somewhere needs to have a formulation or a foundation of a classic. So having said that, I think that there's a decided advantage when it comes to bartending and cocktail creation for people who are pre-COVID, or even especially pre-TikTok and YouTube explosion, because I think people understood the outside the glass aspect of tending bar, of hospitality, of service, that people who have started recently have never really been trained. And I believe that leadership is the main cause of that. I have a really, really deep belief that if we're going to continue this industry in a positive direction, then we as an industry need to get back to our roots, kind of full circle there with the cocktail thing, our roots, and that we need to learn how to empower our managers and our leadership positions in restaurants and bars to train people properly in all of the other aspects of hospitality that don't involve cocktail making. Because again, when I was learning cocktails, I had to learn it, like you said, I had to hit the pavement and I had to go to a bar and either be trained on something, or I needed a bartender I was working with to show me something, or I needed to, and I'll be the first to admit it, kind of waste my boss's product behind the bar working on a cocktail. But nowadays, you don't really need that. Nowadays, I can learn how to make an air at my house in 15 minutes on someone's Instagram or someone's TikTok or YouTube. But what I can't be trained on, and you said it, is that I can't be trained on how to care. And I've been in hiring positions in my career where I said to people, I don't really care what kind of cocktail you can make, because that can be trained. You can not know how to make a cocktail at all. And I can teach you how to make a daiquiri in about 4 seconds. But I can't teach you how to care. I can't teach you how to be self-motivated. And I can't teach you how to be fast. Those are things you either got it or you don't. And I do try to maintain the attitude of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. But I don't believe that people who don't care have a growth mindset. People who don't care have a fixed mindset. They come in and they say, I'm good at this, period. I'm not good at this, period. And people with the growth mindset say, I can get better at this and I can get better at that. And I need to work on this. And those are the people that care. Those are the people who are going to get to the table before the person needs to ask for another drink. They're going to clear the plate that they could probably wait to clear later, but they're going to clear it before they need to. They're going to make a point to remember their guests' names and drink orders and food preferences and allergies and jobs. They're going to care. And that, I think, is the big difference that needs to eventually, we need to, as a group, get back to and care more about and focus on so that we can make this industry continue to grow. So having said all that, sorry, huge tangent. I'm a tangent person, I find. Having said that, what I'm doing now is I am trying to focus in on giving back. Someone I look up to, and I would say a mentor of mine, is a gentleman named Willie Shine. And Willie and I had a meeting, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago. We're kind of living parallel lives a little bit right now. And I said to him that I want to get into more of a consulting role and the ability to help people, whether that means the owner of a bar who is having trouble getting people to come in on slow nights, or the manager of a bar who is having trouble getting their staff to be motivated to do all those things I just said, or a bartender who doesn't understand how to move quicker and needs to be able to make cocktails more efficient, or a group of restaurants or bars or a hotel chain that needs to learn more about hospitality and have guests walking out of there saying, wow, that was an incredible experience. I actually felt seen and cared for and not just another number. So he said to me, when you get to a certain place in the industry, you feel that the industry that has given you everything needs to be given something back. And I loved when he said that, because I was like, yes, that's exactly how I feel right now. So I've gotten to a place now where I've launched my business, Continuous Beverage Solutions. It's been about 6 months, and I am trying to find different ways that I can help the industry grow and get even better.
When you go into modern day bars, we talked about this a little bit, of course, you need to lead with hospitality first, but what are some lessons that you learned along the way that you could share that could just have some immediate improvements for that bar?
Well, it's really interesting because I think that bars are kind of like babies in that you never really know what they're going to be as they grow, right? Like I have 2 children and I can't recognize them from when they were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as now they're 14 and 12, but I don't even recognize them from 3 years ago. They're completely different people. And so I think about employees only is a great example. I went there when the first month that they were open, and there was a beautiful garden in their back of their space. And I remember sitting in there, and it was a glass ceiling, and there were vines all over the glass ceiling. And I remember getting a really good cocktail. It was quiet. It was kind of like a chill, early evening feel. And I was like, this place is beautiful. What a great spot this is. And then about a year later, they were forced to close that back room. There was an issue with the mayor and yada, yada, and somebody complained about a noise violation that lived right behind that space. And so they were forced to close it. And, the owners of the space have become close friends of mine, and they always joke around and they say it's the most expensive storage facility in New York City because that is now a storage facility. But that bar that I walked into is nothing like what it is today, where it is a sardine can of human beings all having a really good time in a very, very loud space. And it's a sexy, sexy space, but it's not what I walked into the first month they were open. Things change. And so what I think when it comes to helping bars is that every bar is different, and there's no one size fits all to help improve a bar. But what I think is consistent across the spectrum, is that every single bar has different needs that they can focus on and improve. And I find that sort of like an avalanche is that if you start to focus in on things and you start to get that sort of mindset of how can we get better? How can we improve? What can we do? It sort of becomes contagious. And then people start to say, well, all right, we fixed that, but what about this? And then they fix that and they say, okay, well, what about this? And you just keep working and keep improving and keep focusing. And I think that's really, really hard to do that, because you can't look at it as though it's a short-term solution. You have to look at a long-term solution. To give you an analogy of this, imagine you were trying to lose 15 pounds. You can go on a crash diet and probably lose 15 pounds. Or you can go on Ozempic and lose 15 pounds. And then 6 months later, you're going to step on the scale and you're going to say, holy shit, I gained all that weight back and more, because you were doing it as a short-term quick fix solution. If you started to exercise in a sustainable way and you took that quick fix, 15 pounds, and you instead lost 1 pound every single week for a year, you would have lost 52 pounds. And you probably would have created a habit that is now something that's part of your daily routine. And you would have said, oh my God, I just lost all that weight and then some. I'm a healthier person and I enjoy this new habit I've picked up. And now it becomes part of your lifestyle. So I think it's the same thing. if I walk into a restaurant and say, I can fix A, B, and C, and then I leave, I'm no better than John Taffer, right? I'm fixing the problem that is though going to become another problem in 6 weeks, a month, whatever. And it's going to only continue to get worse. While if you walk in and say, I'm going to change the attitude, the culture, and make us start to focus on being the best possible restaurant, bar, resort, hotel that we want to be, and it changes the identity and the way you think, then I think that becomes, again, contagious and really helps. So I'll give you an example. I was working at a restaurant where we were fortunate to usually have a line outside the door before we opened. And we would open the door and the bar would flat seat, basically. Every single person would sit down. And we had to, and we being the guy at the door and myself, had to come up with a way of figuring out how to be most efficient with that seating. So what we figured out was there was 16 seats at the bar. So instead of flat seating 16 people and then trying to run around like chickens with their heads cut off, what we figured out was we would sit the first 4 people. And when those 4 people sat, I would go over and I would offer them water. And then I would ask them if they'd like a cocktail or a drink. And then I would tell them the specials. And while I was doing that, he would sit the next 4 people at the other end of the bar. And those 4 people would get the same treatment by a different server. By the time those 4 people were getting situated and figured out, my first 4 were done. And then I would get the next 4. And then we would do it again with the last 4 once those other 4 at the other end of the bar were taken care of. And now we just sat 16 people in a much more efficient way. And then once all of them were sat, the first 4 that had now got water, got a cocktail or a wine, been specialed, were ready to put their order in. And I would take their order. And then that 4 on the other side of the bar would be ready to get their order. And now you had a completely beautiful symphony, is the best way I would describe it, of getting 16 people flat seated within 5 minutes without any look of disorder or chaos. It was a gorgeous situation. We had to work that out through conversation and planning and trial and error because it didn't work the first time. We had to figure out exactly how to make it work, but we made it work. And then as soon as we got that situation done, the next question was, all right, well, what else should we work on? And we just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And it was so inspiring that every time it was a day to go to work, it was, oh man, I can't wait to go to work versus, oh, I got to go to work today.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you look at the bar, you mentioned just a really great bar in New York, especially in its heyday. But when we look at like the employees only, the death and companies, the PDTs of the world and how they began and then what they evolved into is exactly what you're talking about, looking to tweak those changes to make things more efficient, even to make it more inclusive as well. We're talking about an era that was very bro-y too. You didn't see a lot of diversity like we do now. And so I do believe that our industry continues to make positive changes and make room for everyone, but also like the establishments. It's really fun to see, especially those that have been around for such a long time. If you were lucky enough, man, to be in one of those the first month that it's open and then go back today, you will see significant changes because it's growth, like a baby, like you said. Everybody grows up.
Yeah, I think that this industry that we are in has both, just like every other industry, has lots of positives and negatives.
Yeah.
I think that one of the negatives of our industry is that we are surrounded with a ton of smoke and mirrors and bullshit, a ton of it, probably more than the majority of other industries. However, on the other side of it, I would say that we have a different level of inclusivity and culture change than the majority of other worlds. And what I mean by that is I doubt that the electricians union, I don't know anything about the electricians union, I'll start there, but I would doubt that they change culture as fast and as effectively as bars do. And what I mean by that is I am old enough, you are old enough in this industry to remember when jiggers were not around, when fresh juice was not around, when coops were not around, when cold draft ice was not around. And I remember when people started using all of those things and how they were the needle in the haystack. Now it's weird to not have a bar use fresh juice. It's weird to not see a bartender jigger. It's weird to not see a cocktail menu. I mean, you get a cocktail menu at Fridays. It's just what happened was people like Dale DeGroff, Julie Reiner, Audrey Saunders, the EO group, PDT and Jim Meehan and all of those people. And again, this is just speaking from the New York aspect. They changed the world and pretty fast too, all things considered. Nowadays, we change the world in an instant because of social media. But back then, social media wasn't really a thing. And MySpace was around, but that was it. And so you changed the culture of bars and restaurants for good. We're not gonna go back to real lime juice. Then I mean those little bottles of real lime juice. Those days are over. We're not gonna go back to over-sweetened fuzzy navel cocktails and things like that. Like those days are done. Those days are gone. So I think that we were able to turn the Titanic very quickly versus other industries which struggle to change. And again, I realize that this is a complete strange analogy, but the New York Yankees just had a story over the weekend that they now allow their players to have facial hair.
I saw that.
Are you freaking kidding me?
It's so crazy.
Like that really just happened where what century are you living in, right? So again, you think about the industry and the beverage industry and how fast things can change. And I pride myself that I am part of an industry that changes so fast. And so where I was going with this was that I think there are certain people that I really admire as not only just genuinely good people, but are really culture changers. And so Julie Reiner comes to mind and her inclusivity with women and how much she really cares about empowering women in the industry and what they've done. Lynette Marrero and the Speed Rack group and what they've done. Kate Gerwin over in New Mexico and what she's done with her staffing and how she has given, she runs it's a distillery and a bar, but she doesn't have a gigantic restaurant group. And to offer all of her staff health insurance and things like that, this is game changer stuff. And so I'm really admire what they do. And so not to toot my horn or not to try to sort of group myself within a category of people that I really admire, but I'm trying to do the same thing, speaking out about the inclusivity thing when it comes to sobriety. And so, I'm certainly not alone in this. There are some really great people doing this. Derek Brown comes to my mind. Josh Harris out in San Francisco comes to my mind. Nectali Mendoza and Giuseppe Gonzalez. And there's a lot of great
LP's people. Been very outspoken as well.
So, when I think about the people who speak about sobriety, who have been in the trenches as a sober bartender for multiple years, I think that there's a genuineness from certain people. And I think there's an aspect of opportunistic smoke and mirrors from others. And I like to think of myself now about to hit 10 years of sobriety, that I am someone who genuinely wants to help other people understand the value of offering non-alcoholic cocktails in bars, not just on an inclusive standpoint. That's a very important aspect of it, but also on a financial aspect of it too.
Yeah, can we talk about that for a little bit? And first of all, congratulations. You're coming up on 10 years sober, Chris. That is something to absolutely celebrate.
Yeah, Memorial Day weekend.
I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
That's amazing. And I would love to talk about this space with you because I agree, we need to talk about the finances behind the NA cocktails because so many times, even through my work, or I'll get brands asking or clients or friends, whatever it is that are in the space saying, but if I make this cocktail, I have to almost sell it for the same cost as an alcohol with spirits. Can we talk about that? because sometimes I know that when customers come in, they're like, but why is this drink $17 and there's no tequila in it? And my friend's having a margarita and it's $18.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Let's justify that.
There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot. So the first thing is, let's look at it from a financial aspect. If I own a bar and I have a table that holds 4 guests, and those 4 people are under the age of 30, there is a strong chance that one, if not more of them, do not drink alcohol when they go out. That is, the numbers are indisputable about this. This is something we are, and as an industry, have to accept and cannot change. People who are under the age of 30 do not drink like people over the age of 30 years old. It's just a culture change. It's going to change. It's not going to go anywhere. So we have to accept it. So let's just say, for the argument's sake of this conversation, that all 4 of those people do not drink alcohol. If they sit down at my table in my restaurant and I have an average price cocktail at $15, and those 4 people do not drink anything but water at that table, I have now, in theory, at a minimum, lost $60 on the first round. Now, let's say they would have 2 of those rounds. I have now lost $120 on that table. If I have 20 tables and 1/4 of those people do not drink alcohol, then I have now lost, let's just say for argument's sake, $60 times 5 tables. I've lost $300 for the evening. Now I times that by $365 days a year. You see how quick that adds up. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, the second part of this conversation is that people who dine nowadays who are under the age of 30 are also very savvy in their choice making. So I think about my girlfriend, because my girlfriend is gluten-free and dairy-free. So challenging to go out is a nice way to put it. And what she does is she goes online, especially when we travel, and she will do her research into places that she feels like she has options to eat at. It's the same exact thing for people under the age of 30 who don't drink alcohol. They will go on people's websites and search for places that have non-alcoholic options. And if you don't, or if your options are Pepsi and lemonade, they're probably not either not coming to your space or not spending any money at your space. So on a financial aspect, not only does it hurt your sales at the table, but it also hurts your overall guest intake, or the amount of people who will walk through your door and come to your space. It also hurts you on the back end, where people who are finished dinner, who may want to go to the bar for places that have a bar afterwards option, they will not stay and they will leave because there's no other reason for them to be there after they've eaten their meal. So lots of different financial aspects. Then we have the inclusivity aspect. So I am sober, as we just said. If I go to your bar or restaurant and I am not given an option to have a drink at the table, 10 years in, not a big deal for me. I'm used to it. I understand it. It's been my industry for my entire sobriety, basically. And so I'll order a water and I'll deal with it, whatever. But it certainly doesn't enhance my experience. So I am not able to cheers with the table when they all have their cocktails brought to the table. I am not able to avoid a question from someone in the space of why I'm not drinking tonight. I am not able to have something that elevates my meal flavor-wise. So I'm left in the dark, and I'm left with my hands in my pockets many, many nights when I go out. So I think about 2 experiences that really kind of stand out to me. One, I was in Puerto Rico in November, and we went to an incredible restaurant called Casita Miramar, and they had a huge cocktail menu and then a huge non-alcoholic cocktail menu. And one of the drinks jumped out at me. And I think once you get to a certain point of longevity in the industry, ingredients that you don't know get you very excited. And so there was a cocktail that had hobo juice on it. And I grabbed the server and I said, "What's hobo juice? I've never heard of this." And he said, it was indigenous plant to Puerto Rico, tropical, kind of like pineapple-ish, that kind of thing. I said, "I'll take it." Right away, I wanted to try this. And it was an incredible cocktail. I mean, incredible. I could have ordered 5 of them. Non-alcoholic, $17. I didn't even blink an eye. I loved it. It was incredible. What a great way to start my meal with my appetizers. The other one that stands out, I was at a restaurant with about 7 other friends. There was a cocktail menu in front of us when we sat down, and we had made a reservation. They knew that we were all judges for World Class, and they had known our background. So they came into the room, they greeted us. They said, we were so excited to have you all. And they started taking cocktails. I happened to be the last person to order when they went around the room. And after every single other person in the room ordered their cocktail, they said, Chris, we know you don't drink. So what we've done is we've created you a really beautiful non-alcoholic cocktail that we would love to make for you. And I was like, oh, thank you. That sounds incredible. The problem with this was that it spotlighted me to the entire rest of the table as the person who doesn't drink, the person who is quote unquote special. And if I wasn't in 9 years of sobriety at that point, I probably would have been really uncomfortable with that spotlight. There were other ways to do it. So what I would have argued was put it on the menu, and then I would have ordered it without a conversation. And I would argue that maybe 1 or 2 other people at that table might have ordered it also, because they were about to taste and spit 30 drinks a day for 3 straight days. Maybe they didn't want a cocktail that night either, but were sort of peer pressured into the situation of ordering one because there was no other option presented to them. So that's another one that stands out. The other one that stands out actually happened recently, about a month ago. I was at a bar and the bartender said, can I get you something to drink? And I said, no, thank you. And I ordered a tonic water, and there was no cocktail menu for non-alcoholics or anything like that. No options. So I ordered a tonic water. And then at the end of the meal, the bartender brought over 2 little baby coupes and a bottle of grapefruit cello, and said, I would like to give this to you compliments, and started pouring it. And then looked at me, the other person I was with was my girlfriend. She got her grapefruit cello poured for her, and it was put in front of her. And then he looked at me and he said, do you want one? And I said, no, thank you. And he said, oh, okay. He had already poured it. And he said, oh, okay. And looking kind of confused and surprised. And then he put it in front of me, said, I'll just leave it in front of you just in case. Nice. Good service. So there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to this stuff. Now, the last part of the thing is price. So the price thing is a problem of education and mindset. So the first part of this is when it comes to mindset, we have to really take a minute and understand what the value of a cocktail is. So I would argue that the majority of human beings that order alcoholic cocktails are not valuing the flavor of the cocktail, the look of the cocktail, or the enhancement of your meal. What I would argue is the majority of people that order an alcoholic cocktail value what the alcohol does to them in certain ways. So I've had people who have found out I was sober tell me that they like to drink when they have to speak up in public because it cools them down, makes them less nervous. I've had other people tell me that they have drinks when they go on dates because then they're less nervous on their date. I've had other people tell me that they drink after work because they were stressed out and need something to calm them down. But I think the value isn't in the actual ingredients, but it's actually in what the effect of the alcohol does for them. And the reason that I say that is that there is no other analogy that I have yet to think of, and I've tried over and over and over again, to describe the level of strangeness of how we value poison versus non-poison in a drink. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's no one in the world who's going to argue that alcohol is not a poison. We all know it's a poison. Got it. And I'm not going to get into that vilification of alcohol bullshit that I love this industry. I do not have a problem with alcohol. I do not have a problem with people drinking alcohol. I'm not a pariah, and I'm not trying to get the world to sober up. What I am trying to do is understand how we can say, if we all know that alcohol is a poison, that the cocktail with the poison in it should cost more money than the delicious cocktail that doesn't contain the poison. So there's an issue here, because assuming apples to apples, and we're going to assume that both cocktail and non-alcoholic cocktail are made with the same intention, with the same focus on flavor, aroma, mouthfeel, look, everything, length, finish, everything. They're both the same cocktail when it comes to quality of creation. How I can justify saying, you should charge me more money for the one with the poison in it than one without the poison in it. It makes no sense to me. And there's no other analogy I've come up with that can describe that thought. It's sort of like how we as a society justify the fact that the salad option costs more money at McDonald's than the burger does. It makes no sense at all. So having said that, I think that the non-alcoholic spirits industry has a responsibility to educate the public and the bar world about why the products cost as much as they do. And then I think we will solve this problem, because I think it comes from a place of ignorance. And ignorance has a bad rap because ignorance does not necessarily have a negative meaning to it. We put a negative connotation on the word ignorance because it's generally used to think stupid. But the truth is that people are ignorant of what they don't know. And if we don't educate them, then it's our fault, not their fault. And so if you and I right now can explain why Seedlip, Ritual, Aplos, Pathfinder, Liars, on and on and on, these brands that are really, really good products cost the amount of money that they do based on the way they have to produce them, bottle them, and all of the other parts of the cost of making a spirit or a non-alcoholic spirit. If we can't explain that within industry, then we cannot expect the general public to know why it costs so much money. So having said that, I could probably grab a group of 100 bartenders in New York City and say, hey, explain to me the difference of terroir between this mezcal and this mezcal, and 99 of them can go into a freaking dissertation about how the different plots and terroir and everything about these mezcals are different and why their flavors are different and why they're distilled and made, how they're made, and all of this stuff. Because the mezcal industry and the agave industry understood bartenders are the gatekeepers. And if we if we are educated into these things, we can then educate the public sitting in front of us about why they should try A mezcal versus B mezcal versus C mezcal. But if we're not educated in why a bottle of non-alcoholic costs what it costs, and we don't understand how it's made, and all we're given is a bottle to try and said, try it, it's good, you're going to like it, then there's a disingenuous sale that we have to then make to people about why the cocktail should cost the same. And they're not going to buy that because the majority of people think it's just flavored water. And then they say, well, if it's just flavored water, why should I have to pay the same amount? Which is where your original question came from. But here's the argument I'll make, and then I'll stop talking. When I go out as a sober person, I am not bargain shopping. I am not saying I don't want that daiquiri because I don't want to spend $17. It's because I don't want the alcohol in my cocktail. So if you're offering me, and again, I cannot stress this enough, apples to apples, that non-alcoholic cocktail is going to be as delicious as the alcoholic cocktail, I will never bat an eye on spending the same amount of money. Again, it's not a bargain shopping thing. It's a alcohol or no alcohol choice. And I think the majority, not everybody, I'm not going to try to group this as a group thing, but I think the majority of people who don't drink alcohol who are under the age of 30 feel the exact same way. They have disposable income. They will spend it, but they do not want alcohol. So it's up to us to give them options. But again, it has to be high quality, because when I got sober back in 2015, my choices were a bunch of fruit juice in a freaking pint glass or a tonic water. Now, if you give me pineapple juice, cranberry juice, and a lime in a pint glass and try to charge me $17 for it, yeah, I'm with you. That's bullshit. But if you give me what Casita Miramar gave me, which had 8 ingredients or whatever it was, and it had aquafaba, so it was rich and creamy, it had a beautiful aroma, it had all sorts of complexity and depth of flavor, it gave me a long-lasting finish, it was an incredible drink. I would have happily paid $21 for that drink. It's about quality and education. And that is what I am trying to help the rest of the group of people who are pushing this non-alcoholic thing forward. The other problem is that the non-alcoholic space is exploding right now. And just like back in the day when the alcoholic, especially gin world, was exploding, with every good product, you get 5 or 6 bad ones. And so I am the first to say, based on my knowledge of and understanding of flavor and aroma, there is a lot of bad non-alcoholic products out there. And it is, again, up to bartenders and bar owners and managers, people in buying power, to understand the good stuff from the bad stuff and make sure that we're giving people a really good experience and not crap.
Yeah.
There's really bad stuff out there.
No, and it's just, and that's true. Like when any category explodes, I mean, there's always the good, and then you kind of have to take the bad. And then
there's a lot of bad tequilas out there. There's a lot of bad bourbons out there,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. For sure. Where can our guests find you, Chris?
So I am on Instagram at Continuous Bev. My personal is Chris Cardone. The O in Cardone is a 0. I'm edgy like that. The other place you can find me is on my website, which is also continuousbev.com.
Wonderful. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface. I feel a kinship with you in a way.
I'll see you next week.
Yeah. I would love to have you back. And so you can give us an update on what you're doing and, you know, some of these just really great insights that you've given our guests, just something to really think on, which I think is important. I think that's how we start conversations, right? You're kind of throwing out those nuggets to start conversations that are important. So thank you for that. And on behalf of Served Up, I want to wish you some great health and a lot of peace, man.
Thank you. You too, Bridget. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening. Served Up is brought to you by Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits. Produced by Zunu.online. Music by We Killed the Lion can be found on Spotify. Make sure to subscribe to be notified of our future Served Up episodes. Cheers.